Beneath the dust of forgotten archives and the weight of redacted files lies a reality that was never meant to surface. These were not stories told in the open. They were whispers in coded telegrams, scratched into military reports, and then buried under official silence. 5 disturbing experiments of the Second World War that blurred the boundary between military necessity and pure human cruelty. They exist at the edges of morality, preserved only in classified briefings and heavily censored transcripts. Men in white coats became executioners with clipboards. Generals approved trials in the name of survival, and intelligence agencies from both sides of the conflict willingly traded ethics for power. This was not confined to battlefields. It stretched into laboratories, hospitals, and prison camps. As you listen, remember, much of what you will hear was deliberately hidden for decades. It is history written in shadows, not in textbooks. Each chapter reveals another sealed vault of human experimentation, a truth so disturbing it still resists daylight. If these files were never meant to be opened, one must ask, why were they kept at all? And what else still lies unseen, locked behind classified seals, waiting for another generation to stumble across? Stay with us, because the questions only deepen from here. Chapter 1: Classified Trials of Human Endurance. In the closing years of the Second World War, hidden within the sprawling complex of Dachau concentration camp in Bavaria, a series of experiments took place that remain some of the most disturbing in the annals of medical history. These were not ordinary studies conducted in laboratories under the watchful eyes of ethical boards. They were sanctioned by the Reich's highest authorities, commanded directly under Heinrich Himmler's orders, and carried out by Luftwaffe physicians who cloaked their atrocities under the guise of survival research. Their purpose, officially documented in papers marked Geheime Reichssache, top secret, was to understand how long German airmen could endure exposure to the unforgiving elements, particularly when shot down over the North Sea or ejected at high altitudes. In practice, however, these trials became gruesome explorations of the breaking point of human life. The experiments were divided into 2 main categories: freezing tests and high-altitude simulations. The freezing experiments began in 1942 and lasted into 1943, conducted in the bitter winter air and in large tanks filled with ice water. Prisoners, often chosen at random from among Poles, Russians, and other so-called undesirables, were stripped naked and forced into water kept at near zero temperatures. The doctors stood nearby with stopwatches and notebooks, recording the rate at which body temperature dropped, the progression of shivering, the stages of hypothermia, and finally, the silence of death. In some cases, subjects were revived, only to be plunged back again, their survival becoming yet another data point in what the Reich deemed essential research. Witnesses later recalled the eerie silence of these trials, broken only by the labored gasps of men and the occasional barked order from SS guards. Victims would thrash violently at first, then slow into a listless stillness as their bodies surrendered to the cold. Luftwaffe physician Dr. Sigmund Rascher became infamous for orchestrating much of this work. Rascher reported directly to Himmler, who demanded results that could be applied to Air Force survival manuals. His reports contained tables, diagrams, and observations that reduced human suffering into clinical numbers. At least 300 individuals were subjected to the freezing trials. The exact number of deaths remains uncertain, as many records were deliberately destroyed in April 1945 when Dachau faced liberation. Equally disturbing were the high-altitude experiments. These took place in a sealed low-pressure chamber installed within the camp, designed to mimic the conditions of pilots ejecting at altitudes of 20 to 30,000 feet. Prisoners were placed inside, and the chamber's pressure was rapidly reduced. Many convulsed violently, suffering cerebral embolisms and ruptured lungs. Some were dissected immediately afterward to examine the damage caused by rapid decompression. Rascher's reports, later recovered by Allied forces, described men losing consciousness at specific altitudes, their eyes bulging, their veins bursting, while the doctors calmly noted the exact moment of death. Of the 200 prisoners subjected to these trials, most did not survive. Those who did were often permanently disabled, their nervous systems irreparably damaged. When Dachau was liberated in late April 1945, American troops stumbled upon fragments of these experiments. The chamber still standing, the tanks still filled with water. Boxes of documents were seized and eventually shipped to Washington. Within months, parts of Rascher's research began circulating in secret US Air Force medical reports. Although publicly condemned during the Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946, behind closed doors, Allied intelligence argued about the potential value of the findings. Some data on hypothermia, for instance, was quietly integrated into survival manuals used during the Cold War. The victims' agony, reduced to charts and numbers, had outlived them, now hidden under a new layer of secrecy. The moral implications haunted even those who reviewed the material. In transcripts from the doctor's trial, American prosecutor Telford Taylor stated bluntly that the experiments represented murder disguised as science. Yet outside the courtroom, military officials debated whether the data was too valuable to discard. This tension between ethical condemnation and strategic utility defined much of the legacy of these classified trials. While Rascher himself never stood trial, he was executed by the SS in Dachau shortly before liberation, accused of corruption and falling out of favor. His victims' suffering was never fully acknowledged. Many families never learned what became of their loved ones. Their fates dissolved into the void of medical testing. Decades later, when parts of the documentation were declassified, researchers and ethicists confronted a chilling dilemma. Should data derived from atrocities be used to save lives, or should it be buried with the crimes that produced it? Even today, aviation medicine textbooks occasionally reference early hypothermia studies without naming their origin. Survivors who testified at Nuremberg insisted that remembering was a moral duty, that silence would dishonor the dead. And yet, silence is exactly what shrouded these experiments for years, as governments on both sides of the Cold War struggled to balance morality against strategic advantage. What remains of these trials now exists in heavily censored files, many still redacted with thick black ink. The preserved documents describe not only physical suffering, but also the bureaucratic machinery that enabled it. Signed orders, precise funding requests, and Himmler's personal letters demanding accelerated progress. They reveal a disturbing truth, that the machinery of genocide and the machinery of research were often indistinguishable. These were not rogue experiments by renegade scientists. They were state-sanctioned programs, approved at the highest levels, conducted with chilling precision. The story of the classified trials of human endurance forces us to confront questions that remain deeply unsettling. What is the cost of knowledge? When survival for one nation is built on the destruction of others, can the results ever be considered legitimate? And perhaps most hauntingly, how much of what we know about the limits of the human body was born not from curiosity, but from cruelty? The shadows of Dachau linger, not as a relic of the past, but as an unresolved reckoning. The experiments were designed to measure endurance, yet they left behind a record of human fragility that no archive can fully contain. Their echoes stretch far beyond the frozen tanks and sealed chambers, into the very heart of medical ethics and military secrecy, where the boundaries between necessity and atrocity blur into one and the same. Chapter 2: Forbidden Nerve Agents of Porton Down. Hidden behind the rolling hills of Wiltshire in southern England lies one of the most secretive research facilities in modern history, Porton Down. Established during the First World War to study gas warfare, by the time of the Second World War, it had become the epicenter of Britain's chemical and biological weapons research. What began as defensive research quickly expanded into experiments that blurred the line between protection and weaponization. After the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, Allied forces uncovered stockpiles of advanced nerve agents such as tabun and sarin, developed by the German chemical conglomerate IG Farben. These compounds were unlike anything seen before, odorless, colorless, and devastatingly lethal, even in microscopic quantities. While Germany never deployed them on the battlefield, British intelligence recognized their potential. The samples were transferred under tight security to Porton Down, where the War Office authorized classified tests that would span decades. The experiments were shrouded in secrecy. Officially, Porton Down was engaged in defensive research, seeking antidotes and protective measures in case the Soviet Union unleashed chemical warfare. Yet the methods used went far beyond laboratory simulations. Beginning in 1945, hundreds of servicemen, often young, inexperienced recruits, were recruited for what they were told were routine trials to improve equipment and clothing. In reality, many were exposed to controlled doses of sarin, tabun, and an even more obscure compound, codenamed Substance N. These sessions took place in sealed gas chambers and airtight rooms, where volunteers stood in standard-issue uniforms as scientists monitored their breathing and pulse. The participants were rarely informed of the true risks. Many believed they were helping test protective gear. For some, the price was permanent injury. A few never recovered at all. One of the earliest documented fatalities occurred in 1953, when leading aircraftman Ronald Madison, a 20-year-old Royal Air Force engineer, died after liquid sarin was dripped onto his skin during an experiment. The official inquest, conducted under the Official Secrets Act, ruled his death an accident and suppressed the details for half a century. Only in 2004, after declassification and pressure from survivors' families, was the truth acknowledged. Madison had been misled about the nature of the trial and paid with his life. His case was not unique. Many soldiers subjected to nerve agent tests later suffered chronic neurological disorders, seizures, memory loss, and psychological trauma. Yet for decades, their conditions were dismissed as unrelated, buried beneath a wall of classified denials. The logic driving these experiments was rooted in fear. By 1947, intelligence reports suggested that the Soviet Union was also experimenting with chemical stockpiles captured from the Germans. Britain's response was to escalate its own research, ensuring it would not be left vulnerable in the event of a chemical conflict. Declassified minutes from the Chiefs of Staff Committee reveal urgent discussions about maintaining parity with the Soviets. Porton Down became the centerpiece of this strategy. The facility's remit expanded beyond nerve agents to include blister agents, choking agents, and experimental compounds synthesized in its laboratories. Some were given innocuous codenames, Compound 17, Substance X, yet their effects were anything but harmless. Each trial sought not just to study defense, but to perfect delivery systems and assess lethality. Civilians were not always spared. Documents uncovered in the 1990s revealed that small doses of chemical agents were released in controlled trials near populated areas, often without the knowledge of local residents. In one series of tests during the 1950s, harmless simulants were sprayed from aircraft to study dispersal patterns. But questions remain about whether more dangerous compounds were also tested. Farmers reported livestock deaths, unexplained illnesses, and strange residues on crops. Official inquiries decades later admitted that public consent had never been sought, but insisted the risk was minimal, a claim still disputed by independent researchers. Within the facility itself, the secrecy was absolute. Scientists were sworn under oath, their work compartmentalized so that few understood the full scope of the program. Reports were stamped with heavy black top secret markings, circulated only to senior officials within the Ministry of Defense. Even within government, many were unaware of the details. Parliamentary questions about Porton Down were routinely deflected with vague assurances of defensive work. It was not until the 1990s, after mounting pressure from veterans and investigative journalists, that glimpses of the classified experiments emerged. Survivors formed associations, campaigning for recognition and compensation, only to be met with bureaucratic silence. The ethical breach lay not only in the exposure, but in the deception. Many servicemen were told they were participating in research for cold remedies or testing protective clothing. They signed consent forms written in deliberately vague language, never informed that they would be handling one of the most lethal substances known to humanity. Their trust in the military was exploited for scientific ends, leaving them as unwitting subjects in trials that mirrored, in method if not scale, the atrocities Britain had publicly condemned at Nuremberg. The irony was not lost on later historians. While denouncing the barbarity of Nazi science, Britain had quietly sanctioned experiments that violated the same principles of informed consent. Even after partial disclosures, much remains hidden. The full extent of Porton Down's nerve agent trials is still classified under the Official Secrets Act, with many files closed until at least 2070. Former scientists and technicians have spoken only in fragments, careful not to breach security laws. Some insist the experiments saved lives by producing effective antidotes and protective equipment. Others, however, admit privately that the balance between science and morality was dangerously skewed. The Cold War environment provided justification for risks that would never have been tolerated in peacetime. Survival, in the eyes of strategists, outweighed the suffering of a few. Ronald Madison's inquest became a turning point, forcing the government to acknowledge decades of denial. The coroner's jury ruled his death an unlawful killing, a landmark decision that reverberated through the Ministry of Defense. Yet compensation for victims remained piecemeal, and the deeper truth about the scale of testing has never been fully released. Families of servicemen still request access to medical records sealed under classification. Many have died without answers, their illnesses attributed to vague service conditions rather than deliberate exposure. The story of Porton, Down's forbidden nerve agent experiments, illustrates how secrecy and fear can erode the very values a nation claims to defend. While Britain stood publicly for justice at Nuremberg, condemning human experimentation, behind closed doors it pursued its own program, hidden under layers of secrecy and justified by the looming Soviet threat. These trials were not conducted on enemies, but on Britain's own sons, soldiers who believed they were serving their country, only to discover too late that they had become test subjects in a forbidden chapter of history. The legacy endures in classified files, redacted memos, and in the memories of those who survived but were never meant to speak. It is a legacy that raises uncomfortable questions about what governments will do in the name of security, and how easily lines between defense and exploitation can be crossed when fear dictates policy. Chapter 3: Disturbing Mind Control Projects Erased. When the guns of the Second World War fell silent in 1945, a new conflict began. Not on open battlefields, but in hidden laboratories, psychiatric wards, and intelligence vaults. The Cold War ignited an obsession with the human mind itself and its potential for control. What few outside the inner circles of intelligence agencies knew was that the groundwork for these disturbing programs had already been laid during the war. The experiments carried out by Nazi doctors in concentration camps and Japanese physicians in Unit 731 provided a foundation of data that would later be repurposed, not destroyed. Through Operation Paperclip, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and medical experts were quietly relocated to the United States. Their past crimes were scrubbed, their records rewritten, and their expertise redirected into America's new struggle against the Soviet Union. Among them were specialists in aviation medicine, pharmacology, and neurology, men who had overseen experiments in Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Harbin. They did not arrive empty-handed. They brought with them case files, notebooks, and results extracted through human suffering, much of which never reached public tribunals. The most secretive of these imported sciences centered on psychology and behavior. By the late 1940s, the US military and intelligence services had become increasingly alarmed at reports of Soviet and Chinese brainwashing techniques. American prisoners of war in Korea spoke of indoctrination, forced confessions, and prolonged psychological pressure. The Central Intelligence Agency, newly formed in 1947, responded by launching projects designed to discover whether the human will could be broken, reshaped, or erased entirely. At first, these programs were cloaked under innocuous labels like behavioral research, but in reality, they were extensions of wartime atrocities, transplanted into American soil under new code names such as Bluebird, Artichoke, and eventually the infamous MK Ultra. The methods were deeply unsettling. At secret facilities such as Camp King in Germany, Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, and psychiatric hospitals across the United States and Canada, experiments tested the limits of sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and drug-induced compliance. Soldiers, prisoners, and psychiatric patients became unwitting participants. Some were subjected to high doses of LSD, mescaline, or barbiturates, substances chosen not for their therapeutic value, but for their ability to distort perception and weaken resistance. Others endured extended isolation in soundproof rooms, their sense of time and identity collapsing after days or weeks in total darkness. Electroconvulsive therapy was applied at intensities far beyond medical norms, not to treat, but to erase memory. Every trial was carefully recorded, often with film cameras and detailed transcripts, most of which would later be destroyed when exposure threatened. Fragments of these disturbing projects can be traced to earlier wartime files. Nazi experiments with mescaline at Dachau, designed to test its ability to extract information from resistant prisoners, were directly reviewed by US interrogators in 1945. Similarly, Japanese studies of sleep deprivation and torture in Unit 731 were quietly examined by American intelligence officers who struck immunity deals with Shiro Ishii and his staff. Instead of prosecuting these war criminals, Officials rationalized that their expertise could provide an edge in the shadow war against Moscow. The victims of Dachau and Harbin were erased twice, first by death, and second by the repurposing of their tormentors' knowledge. In 1950, the CIA escalated these efforts under Project Bluebird, later renamed Artichoke. Internal memos, now declassified, revealed chilling questions asked by officials. Could drugs create amnesia in spies? Could hypnosis compel someone to assassinate without memory of the act? Could enhanced interrogation produce total compliance? These were not rhetorical thought exercises. They were directives for experiments carried out on living subjects. One memo dated January 1952 describes tests conducted on foreign nationals held in secret detention, where morphine, sodium pentothal, and electrical shocks were combined in efforts to produce truth-telling states. Results were inconsistent, but the obsession with control only deepened. By 1953, these fragmented projects were consolidated into a vast umbrella program known as MK-Ultra, authorized directly by CIA Director Allen Dulles. Its funding was hidden within innocuous research grants to universities, hospitals, and private laboratories. Professors believed they were studying new psychiatric treatments. In reality, they were conduits for intelligence experiments on unwitting students, patients, and employees. At McGill University in Montreal, Dr. Ewan Cameron conducted psychic driving trials under CIA sponsorship. His patients, many of whom sought help for anxiety or depression, were subjected to weeks of drug-induced comas, endless repetitions of recorded messages, and violent electroshock sessions. Instead of healing, many emerged with erased memories, childlike dependencies, or permanent psychological damage. Cameron's findings were filed back to Langley under classified channels, while his patients' voices were silenced by confidentiality agreements and fear. The secrecy was near total. Even within the CIA, knowledge of MK-Ultra was compartmentalized to only a handful of officers. Thousands of documents were destroyed in 1973 on the orders of director Richard Helms, leaving historians and investigators to reconstruct the program from fragments accidentally overlooked. What survives paints a disturbing continuity from wartime atrocities to Cold War intelligence research. Techniques tested in the camps of Europe and the labs of Manchuria reappeared in CIA manuals for interrogations in the 1960s, circulated under the bland title Kubak Counterintelligence Interrogation. Within these pages lay references to sensory deprivation, sleep manipulation, and drug-based compliance, the very methods once condemned at Nuremberg. The victims of these erased projects rarely received recognition. Soldiers who volunteered believing they were contributing to national security found themselves plagued by hallucinations and memory loss. Psychiatric patients trusted their doctors only to be reduced to test subjects. Prisoners in overseas facilities endured torments they could not describe, their fates buried in classified cables. And woven through it all was a deliberate policy of erasure. Case files destroyed, names redacted, evidence suppressed. To this day, many families suspect their relatives were involved, but can find no documentation, only silence. What is most disturbing is the normalization of these methods. While headlines condemned Nazi doctors for their barbarity, Western intelligence quietly adopted their results under new euphemisms. Coercion became behavioral research. Torture became interrogation enhancement. Memory destruction became therapeutic innovation. The language softened the reality, but the suffering remained the same. The continuity between Dachau, Harbin, and Langley is not theoretical. It is written in the margins of surviving files, stamped with classification marks that still withhold full truth. Today, historians and ethicists continue to debate how far these programs reached and whether their ultimate goals were ever realized. What is certain is that the pursuit of mind control consumed vast resources, spanned decades, and left countless victims silenced by secrecy. It is a chapter of history deliberately erased, not because it failed, but because it succeeded just enough to terrify those who knew. And so the question lingers: if these disturbing projects were built on the ashes of war crimes, how many other hidden legacies of World War II still shape intelligence work today? Unseen, unacknowledged, and waiting in classified vaults. Chapter 4: Hidden Plutonium Injections Classified. At the height of the atomic age, as the mushroom clouds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still cast their long shadows across history, the United States turned its gaze toward an invisible enemy, radiation. The dawn of nuclear warfare created a new urgency, one that drove scientists and military officials alike into a frenzy of experimentation. What no one outside a tight circle of classified committees knew was that this research would come at a staggering human cost. Between 1945 and 1947, in hospitals across America, unsuspecting patients were secretly injected with plutonium, uranium, and other radioactive isotopes. These individuals were never asked for consent. Many were elderly, poor, or terminally ill, chosen precisely because their deaths would not attract public attention. Their suffering was meticulously documented in medical notebooks, not as patients in need of care, but as test subjects in an experiment hidden under layers of atomic secrecy. The program was overseen by the Manhattan Project's medical section, under the direction of Dr. Stafford L. Warren and later the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC. Files marked classified, restricted data reveal the clinical precision with which doctors tracked the spread of radioactive particles through the human body. Doses of plutonium were injected intravenously into unsuspecting patients at hospitals in Rochester, Chicago, San Francisco, and Oak Ridge. Each patient was assigned a code number, HP3, HP7, HP12, reducing human lives to sterile identifiers. Doctors measured excretion in urine and feces, calculating how long the body retained the isotope, how it deposited into bone, and how it damaged tissue. The victims were left in the dark, told only that they were receiving experimental treatments for their illnesses. In reality, their suffering was being harvested for data that military officials believed essential for protecting workers in nuclear facilities and for assessing fallout from future weapons tests. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 1945 at a hospital in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where a 53-year-old African-American man, known only as patient HP12, was injected with plutonium without his knowledge. He died less than a year later, his remains secretly harvested for analysis. Similar cases unfolded across the country. At the University of California Hospital in San Francisco, researchers under Dr. Joseph Hamilton injected multiple patients with isotopes while reporting directly to the AEC. Hamilton himself would later warn that if such practices were exposed, they would be compared to the atrocities committed by Nazi doctors, an eerie acknowledgement of the moral chasm these experiments had crossed. The deception extended beyond injections. In the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a classified program known as Project Sunshine expanded the collection of human tissues. Without permission, body parts from deceased individuals, including infants and children, were gathered from hospitals and morgues worldwide. Bones, particularly those of children, were of special interest because they absorbed strontium-90, a radioactive byproduct of nuclear fallout. Families who buried their loved ones never knew that samples had been removed, shipped in sealed containers to laboratories in the United States and Britain, where they were incinerated, dissolved, and analyzed. Official records described these samples in sanitized terms: specimens, materials, samples. Nowhere did they acknowledge the human violation at the core of the program. The justification for these hidden experiments lay in the escalating arms race. By 1949, the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb, and American officials feared falling behind in understanding long-term radiation exposure. The US government's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, established in the 1990s, would later uncover hundreds of classified files that revealed the logic of the era. Survival of the nation justified the sacrifice of the individual. Patients and cadavers became data points, their consent irrelevant in the calculus of national security. The committee's 1995 final report concluded that these acts represented a fundamental violation of human rights, but by then, many of the perpetrators had died, and the victims' names remained hidden beneath code numbers. Declassified memos reveal an unsettling consistency in official attitudes. A 1947 letter from Manhattan Project official, Colonel Stafford Warren, warned that disclosure would severely damage public trust and invite unfavorable comparisons to enemy practices. Instead of halting the experiments, the government doubled down on secrecy. Reports were stamped confidential or restricted, access limited to a handful of military and scientific elites. Families were given misleading explanations for their relatives' suffering, often told that unusual symptoms were the result of their underlying illnesses. not deliberate exposure to radioactive poisons. The secrecy was airtight, the silence deliberate. It was not until the 1970s, in the wake of the Watergate scandal and growing distrust of government institutions, that fragments of the truth began to surface. Investigative journalists obtained leaked documents revealing radiation experiments on unwitting civilians. Congressional hearings in 1986 forced partial admissions from Department of Energy officials. Survivors and families of victims testified, demanding accountability. Yet the answers they received were incomplete, the apologies carefully worded, the compensation limited. Many families never learned the full details of what had been done to their relatives, their loved ones reduced to lines in a declassified spreadsheet. The deeper question remains unresolved. How much of this research continues to shape our present? Techniques for measuring internal radiation doses, safety protocols for nuclear workers, and models for fallout dispersion all trace their lineage back to these hidden trials. The data, though tainted by its origins, was never discarded. Instead, it was quietly folded into official handbooks and safety manuals, stripped of context, but not of consequence. The victims, stripped of dignity and life, were stripped again in death, erased from the record even as their bodies became the foundation of nuclear science. The classified plutonium injections stand as a chilling reminder that victory in World War II did not immunize the victors from moral corruption. In their desperation to master the atomic age, American officials replicated patterns of exploitation they had condemned in others. The doctors in white coats, operating under government orders, treated human beings not as patients, but as instruments, disposable, replaceable, and ultimately forgettable. Their notebooks remain in archives, their findings still cited in radiation research, while their victims lie in graves that hold secrets never fully confessed. As with so many shadows of that era, the final files remain sealed. Redacted pages and withheld documents ensure that the full scope of these experiments may never be known. Yet enough has surfaced to paint a disturbing picture. Hospitals turned into laboratories of secrecy, patients turned into code numbers, and suffering converted into data points. The plutonium injections were not accidents. They were deliberate, calculated, and classified to remain hidden. And though decades have passed, the silence surrounding them still echoes like a warning that in the pursuit of power, even the most celebrated democracies can embrace the forbidden. Chapter 5: Secrets of Japan's Unit 731 Erased. In the frozen plains of Manchuria, near the city of Harbin, there once stood a sprawling complex known only to insiders as Unit 731. Officially, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Imperial Japanese Army. In reality, it was a fortress of horror, constructed in 1936 and operating under absolute secrecy until Japan's defeat in 1945. At its height, the compound covered more than 6 square kilometers, guarded by barbed wire, armed soldiers, and a wall of silence. Within its walls, some of the most disturbing human experiments of the 20th century were carried out. Experiments so grotesque that even Nazi doctors in Europe took note of their brutality. The victims were Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, Korean forced laborers, and others deemed expendable. They were never called humans by their captors. They were dehumanized as maruta, logs, anonymized and reduced to disposable material for research. The work of Unit 731 was designed to weaponize disease itself. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a physician and microbiologist, Japanese military doctors conducted deliberate infections with plague, cholera, anthrax, typhus, and syphilis. Subjects were injected with pathogens and then observed in sealed rooms as their bodies broke down. Some were vivisected alive, organs removed without anesthesia, so that scientists could examine the real-time progression of disease. Others were tied to stakes and exposed to bombs laced with bacteria or shrapnel coated in toxins. Frostbite experiments mirrored those in Nazi camps, with prisoners' limbs submerged in icy water until frozen solid, then shattered with blunt instruments to study gangrene. No detail was spared, no cruelty avoided, if it meant producing data that could be converted into weapons of mass suffering. These atrocities were not limited to laboratory confines. Field experiments extended into the surrounding countryside, where plague-infested fleas were released from aircraft, spreading outbreaks in Chinese villages. Water supplies were poisoned with cholera, causing epidemics that decimated entire communities. The destruction was carefully recorded by Japanese officers who measured mortality rates, infection speeds, and environmental persistence. For them, it was not a massacre, but a trial run, a rehearsal for bacteriological warfare that might one day be unleashed on enemy nations. Estimates suggest that over 200,000 civilians perished from deliberate disease outbreaks linked to Unit 731 operations during the war. Yet, when Japan surrendered in August 1945, very little of this was made public. The reason for the silence lies not only in Japan's defeat, but in the bargains struck in its aftermath. As the US Army moved into occupied Japan, its intelligence officers discovered fragments of Unit 731's work. They quickly realized the immense military value of the data. In secret negotiations, General Ishii and his senior staff were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for handing over their research. Declassified cables from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters confirm that American officials believed the information on plague, anthrax, and frostbite survival would give the United States a decisive edge over the Soviet Union. The decision was made. The war crimes of Unit 731 would be erased from the official record, its leaders shielded from justice. While German doctors faced judgment at Nuremberg, Ishii retired quietly in Japan, living in relative comfort until his death in 1959, never once tried for his crimes. The Soviet Union, however, pursued a different course. In 1949, the Soviets convened the Khabarovsk war crime trials, where 12 members of Unit 731 were tried for their roles in biological warfare. Testimonies detailed vivisections, plague bombs, and frostbite experiments, providing some of the earliest direct evidence of the unit's atrocities. The sentences were severe but fell short of death. Many defendants were later repatriated to Japan. In the West, these trials were dismissed as propaganda, their revelations buried beneath Cold War skepticism. The American government, keen to protect its bargain with Ishii, insisted there was no proof of large-scale Japanese biological warfare. As a result, the atrocities of Unit 731 faded from global consciousness, remembered only by survivors and the families of victims. The suppression extended into Japanese society itself. For decades after the war, textbooks omitted or downplayed the existence of Unit 731. Survivors who tried to speak were silenced by stigma, fear, or indifference. Only in the 1980s and 1990s, through the efforts of historians and whistleblowers, did fragments of the truth re-emerge. Former soldiers broke their silence, describing how they had rounded up civilians, transported prisoners, or prepared experiments without fully understanding the broader picture. Declassified US documents confirmed what survivors had long claimed, that immunity had been exchanged for research, that justice had been sacrificed for military advantage. Yet even now, the full archives of Unit 731 remain sealed, with entire collections of reports never released to the public. The legacy of these erased secrets is profound. Modern biological warfare defenses, from vaccines to protective protocols, carry traces of knowledge derived from Unit 731's crimes. Although sanitized in official reports, the origins of some findings can be traced back to Harbin's laboratories. The victims remain nameless in these records, reduced to numbers and symptoms. Families in Manchuria still speak of unexplained epidemics, strange military cordons, and relatives who disappeared without explanation. Their grief was compounded by official denial. Their history buried beneath Cold War bargains. The haunting reality is that the atrocities of Unit 731 were not only committed, they were preserved, sanitized, and quietly repurposed. The decision to erase them from public record was deliberate, driven by the same logic that justified the plutonium injections in the United States or the nerve agent trials at Porton Down. Knowledge was power, and morality was a luxury too costly to afford. The victims of Unit 731 were betrayed not only by their captors, but by a global system that decided their suffering was useful. In the end, the most disturbing secret is not what was done in Harbin's frozen fields, but how willingly the world agreed to forget. The curtain may have fallen on the Second World War 80 years ago, but its shadows remain long, jagged, and unresolved. The disturbing experiments uncovered in these classified files do not exist as relics of the past. They ripple through the present, hidden in safety manuals, whispered in military doctrine, and buried in the fine print of medical research. What is most haunting is not simply the cruelty inflicted, but the deliberate erasure that followed. Governments suppressed documents, traded immunity for knowledge, and allowed perpetrators to live quietly while their victims were reduced to code numbers or forgotten graves. Each file that surfaces raises more questions than it answers. How much of what we take for granted in modern science and security was born of suffering never acknowledged? How many vaults still remain locked, holding reports too explosive to release? As listeners, we are left with the uneasy truth that history's darkest chapters are often written in ink designed to fade. And so the question falls to us: will we continue to look away, accepting the silence, or will we demand that the shadows be illuminated, no matter how disturbing the light may be? Share your thoughts, because this story is far from over.